Okay, I hope everybody can hear me. Welcome everybody. This is session number 33 of our continuing education, basically. And I'm a student of knowledge like all of us. So every day I learn something new. So when Dr. Francis and Dr. Marcus sent me those papers, I was very pleased to read them and learn about these subjects. So I'll leave the floor for Marcus, and you can introduce yourself, and maybe if Francis want to follow with any additional comments, and then we will have a discussion. Okay?
That's absolutely fine. Yes, Marcus and I have agreed that I will start, and then Marcus will take over. So my name is Francis Gilbert at the University of Nottingham in England, where I've been for the last 39 years, amazingly. I shall be retiring at the end of next year, so it's a bit of a shame to meet you so late in my career, because I've been working in Sinai for a very long time, since 1986, really the early 1990s, where we've studied a whole range of different things. I basically just fell in love with the environment the very first time I went there. And I had a PhD student who was working there. So I went fairly regularly and then took up research projects of my own, where we studied a whole range of different things, from plants, insects, mostly plants and insects, because insect ecology is my fundamental field, and pollination biology in particular is my interest. So I'm very interested in the relationships between insects and plants. My special subject is hoverflies, but there aren't any in Sinai, inconveniently. And so we've worked, as I say, on a whole range of other things, from wolves at the high end of the spectrum all the way down to plants and little tiny insects. So I've taken many students, many colleagues, trying to get them involved in various aspects of Sinai biology. The great thing about South Sinai and the park where we work is that it's all in the high mountains. And as you know, high mountains are the refuges from climate change for many plants and insects. So you find up in the high mountains of Sinai many plants and animals that you don't find anywhere else. In fact, it's the hotspot for Egypt's biodiversity. Of course, Egypt's biodiversity is not huge for many groups, but it is for all the arid land plants and animals. But up in the high mountains, you get vestiges of the fauna and flora from much further north these days. And that includes some very special plants and insects. Fewer vertebrates, it's true. There aren't any endemic vertebrates, but there are 2 endemic butterflies to the mountains, which we've studied in quite some detail. As we worked, as I hope you've read in my summary of our work in the Harkness website that I sent you, as we worked, we got more and more interested in what the local people were doing, because they were obviously the experts. All the projects that we did had local guides attached to them who proved to be immensely knowledgeable about all sorts of aspects of their natural world. And my wife became so interested that she became an anthropologist in order to study them. And what she found out was really very interesting indeed about their position in Egyptian society, their attitudes to their local environment, and all sorts of other things. And we've come to realize that the Sinai environment is a product of the way the local people manage their lives, like so many other areas of the world. In fact, probably all areas of the world, including the deepest tropical forest, are molded by the actions of human beings. And it's not surprising that conservation has turned more and more to examining this interaction. The people are also very interesting from a biological point of view because of the traditional cousin marriage. They tend to be inbred, and as I put in the summary, they're some of the least genetically diverse people on the earth, and that has consequences for their health. And that's one of the reasons why we became so interested and tried to help. So Marcus can outline the project that we did with our joint student, Olivia Norfolk, a wonderful student, which encapsulates a lot of the ideas that we have about the place. Do you want to take over, Marcus?
Sure, thanks. I'll just begin by introducing how I got into this personally. I'm a forest ecologist largely, with an interest in agroforestry and how people use and live with trees. I started out looking at agroforestry in Europe and developed a keen interest in learning from traditional systems of agriculture, because people many thousands of years ago worked out how to live sustainably on the land and how to manage it in a way that supported themselves and food production, while retaining throughout the Mediterranean one of the most diverse sets of habitats on Earth. And so I think by studying these agroforestry systems, we can gain great insights, particularly for dryland systems, for how we might design future systems for a changing world under climate change and desertification. So really, I'm very keen on learning from the past in order to gain lessons for the future. We don't need new crops necessarily. We don't need new techniques. We can learn from our ancestors and try and extend those lessons to other parts of the world. I came into the Sinai system through collaborating with Francis and our PhD student, Olivia Norfolk, who sadly died last year after a long illness. But I must confess, I have never been to Egypt and I've never been to Sinai. So all of my involvement in this has been as a supervisor and analyzing data. So I have no personal contact with it. However, the systems that we see in Sinai or hear about are similar to rainfall harvesting systems that exist elsewhere in the world. So there are ancient systems that the Moors developed in central Spain. There are also records of similar systems in northern Colombia and in Mexico, where people harvest the rain. Sometimes they refer to it as farming the rain. They build channels that collect rainwater and divert it into pools, where it is either held or percolates into the soil, and therefore supports agriculture for long periods of the year when it would otherwise be impossible. In Sinai, these channels and this system was set up at least 1,000 years ago. Francis can correct me on this, but it's believed to date back at least as long as the monastery at St. Catherine's. And it allows people to grow their own food in one of the driest inhabited parts of the world, with a rainfall that is not only extremely low in the hundreds of millimeters per year, but highly irregular. So there will be occasional large downpours, and the wadis show the evidence of this with tracks gouged out from floods that have come down them, but where it is simply not predictable. So by having the channels and by diverting this rainfall and slowing it down and allowing it to percolate into the rocks and the foundations below the villages, they are able to use this water for much longer than they otherwise would be. And the critical innovation of this is the walled gardens, which were the focus of Olivia's study. These walled gardens are man-made oases. They capture this slightly greater dampness in the soil where it comes out through the bases of the wadis at the bottoms of the valleys around their villages. And they use these walled gardens to support themselves and their families, often through harder times and when it becomes necessary, but as a subsidiary income. What Olivia found was that within these gardens, they contain a very high species richness and functional richness of plants, much higher actually than the surrounding vegetation. So they are boosting the diversity of plants above the background. That makes them the center really for conservation activity in the Sinai, because these are the highest diversity places, are these man-made habitats. As well as having a greater diversity of plants, they support a greater diversity of insects. And Olivia's focus was on the pollinators, and she showed that the gardens not only attract and contain a higher diversity of pollinators, but that the way that the plant diversity is structured supports those pollinators through a larger proportion of the year, because there is a succession of floral resources that continues throughout the growing season and allows populations of pollinators to be maintained even when floral resources are very scarce in the wider landscape. By bringing these insects in, they also benefit production in these systems. Another of Olivia's experiments focused on pollination rates of almond trees. And she showed that the almonds were better pollinated by wild bees than anything else, and that these wild bees were found in the orchards coming to the ground crops. And so the pollination rates of the almonds in the orchards were greater than those in commercial production, lower down in Egypt. Interestingly, the bees were coming in not for the orchard trees themselves, but they were coming for the ground crops that are grown underneath them. And as I'm sure you're all well aware, these are often cultural crops that have no financial value, but are often herbs and other crops that are grown for making particularly tea or for herbs for cooking. So these are home products that people are putting there, and it's things in the Lamiaceae largely. It's your thymes, your rosemaries, and other such things that are highly beneficial for bees. And those bees then come to those and visit the trees afterwards. So that's once again a place where the cultural link is crucial. It's not just about the architecture and the design of the garden, it's about what they're putting in there and the types of plants they're supporting, which in turn is boosting diversity at a landscape level. The final study I'll mention is in collaboration with a master student who was visiting. They looked at bird diversity in the gardens. And Sinai is on one of the great migration routes between tropical Africa and Europe. Many birds pass through Sinai on their way from their overwintering grounds in Africa up to the whole of Eurasia. Although they're only there transiently, the gardens prove to be an extremely important resource because the trees provide a perching site, The increased water availability provided some option for drinking water, and the insects provided some sustenance for these migratory birds. So in the same way as areas around the world, say under the Ramsar scheme, protect wetlands because they support wetland birds, even if they're only there for a few days a year, we should also think about these gardens as being a keystone resource for migratory birds, which may only pass through twice a year, but these are crucial habitats that are supporting these species as they move across the world. So building on this, I have a strong interest, which is what I mentioned to Mazin, about how we can learn lessons from what the Bedouin in Sinai are doing and other parts of the world to try and build sustainability and conservation into our landscapes, because sometimes it is the people and the gardens and what humans are adding that gives both the conservation value and create sustainable systems that we can rely on for the future. So that's as much as I have to say. I don't know if Francis wants to add to that, or?
Yes, I do actually. One of the really interesting ways in which the Bedouin are incredibly knowledgeable about their landscape is the way in which the volcanic and the granitic rocks interact in Sinai. I don't know what the geology is like in Palestine, but in Sinai you have this, particularly in St. Catherine, there is this great ring dike, circular area where the magma welled up around a central core of granite. So you have these two rocks, one of which is impermeable and the other permeable. And so that creates the ideal conditions for, if you can slow the water down, for the water to percolate the permeable rock and get stopped by the impermeable rock and create the ability to dig a well. And most of the gardens are built around wells, and the local people are just brilliant at finding these particular areas where water is to be found. Of course, as I think I've put in the Harkness summary, the digging of a well and the creation of a garden around it is an enormous investment, absolutely enormous. And as far as we know, these Bedouin in South Sinai are the only Bedouin who do this, who make these kinds of gardens. There are some vague equivalents in Saudi, I understand, which I've never seen. But these sophisticated gardens are probably unique. And probably, as Marcus mentioned, they develop the expertise in conjunction with the monks. Sinai in the 4th century was a hive of hermits living in caves all over the mountain massif and creating gardens in order to survive. So it was a Byzantine thing to create gardens associated with monks. So I can talk about any of our other projects. We've had a very long-running project about the parasites of spiny mice, Acamis, for example, run by one of my colleagues, and all sorts of other projects, like on the white-crowned black wheatear, which is a particularly interesting bird in its behaviour. But it depends what you're interested in.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we're developing in Palestine research areas, in different areas. We have some people here from various backgrounds, including the Ministry of Agriculture and others attending in the room with me and also online. I'm sure they'll have a lot of questions. I personally am very interested in your project on spiny mice, since I wrote a book on the mammals of the Holy Land, and I was doing some parasitology work in older days, so maybe we can develop something like this. But there are also people here who are interested in pollinators, etc., and who might want to ask you some questions. Or I just want to make a quick comment before I let people speak. Is that we have done some work in Al Makhrur Valley area around some communities here, like Hussein, Al Walaja, Batir, etc., around these issues of biodiversity and in mixture of agriculture, and how this is very, very important to promote livelihood of people, but also sustainability of nature. So that's why we have a lot of interaction. So I actually have two quick questions. You don't have to answer them now. We can talk about them later. One is about the plowing of the lands, whether you think, I mean, I've been discouraging plowing because of what you mentioned about the undergrowth and the pollinators and the wildlife around, for example, olive trees, etc. So that's one question. The other question I had for you is about the actual studies that you have done. For example, when you did transects that are diagonal and looked at plant biodiversity, did you have a botanist working with you, or did you teach yourself botany? Or we're having difficulty here finding enough people knowledgeable about plant taxonomy to help us in many of our areas. These are my two quick questions, and then maybe the others can ask questions.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that, if I may, because actually, and Marcus may well have as well, throughout, I mean, as I say, I started in the 1980s, and for about 20 years, I would say, our major difficulty, we had two. The first, maps of the area, because all maps in Egypt seem to be secret and militarily sensitive. And the second was the identification of plants, which was always quite difficult, except there are some very good guides to the local words for different plant species. So one of the things that I did was to make a big database of everything that was published on the Arabic names for plants. And that has proved to be extraordinarily useful, because the local people know exactly what these plants are. And as long as the local name has been recorded, then the identification is very much easier.
Okay, thanks. All right, Ahmed Al-Omari raised his hand. Go ahead, Ahmed.
First of all, thank you so much for this information, and really it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm interested in conservation and agroecology and agrobiodiversity. I work a lot in this field. I think here in Palestine, we have one of the most important agroforestry ecosystem that is sustainable for thousands of years, especially for olive orchards here, for ancient olive orchards, which have really high biodiversity. And also, there's a lot to learn from this orchard, because they're sustainable by farmers for thousands of years. There's a lot of practices that farmers do here, really amazing, especially in water harvesting and how they improve biodiversity, intercropping, and other things. So I think this is a really amazing field to study here, because really it's difficult. Nobody cares too much about this agrobiodiversity here in Palestine. There's very few research about this topic here. But I think there's a lot of potential to do work, especially in this field, because nobody studied thoroughly before. And also, there's a lot of terrain to learn from this, especially because it's really high in biodiversity. I did the research in plant biodiversity in these fields and compare them by traditional practices and organic practices. There's no difference in biodiversity between traditional and organic. That means the traditional practices really comply with organic practices, because farmers, they don't use herbicides, pesticides, and other bad practices, let's say. So there's a lot of things to do and to learn from this area here in Palestine. Also for pollinators, there's a few research about this topic also. There's a lot of work to do, especially in this agriculture area and agro-biodiversity in this area. So really interesting topic, and there's a lot of to learn and to search here in this topic here in Palestine, I think. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to meet you all. My pleasure is entirely mine. I'll let Marcus reply mostly to that, but I think one of the great challenges that Olivia faced in her work was identification of the insects. Luckily, she had done a year's identification of pollinators in the UK, so she knew what she was looking at. But even so, the collaboration of experts in each of the taxa was absolutely critical. Although she worked with morphospecies for much of the time, but the actual attaching of the names, she was dedicated enough to drive that through to its conclusion, which is not too common, actually. Marcus.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just respond quickly to Ahmed. And I agree absolutely. Olive agroforestry is a really wonderful system for maintaining diversity. It's being recognized more in Europe now because there are similar systems throughout South Portugal, Spain, Greece, in Turkey, and also in North Africa. But in Europe, the challenge has been that through the European Union, they weren't recognized as being a distinct agricultural category. And so they lost a lot of their biodiversity value because they were forced to either focus on high production of olives, or the olives were removed for other forms of agriculture. So these mixed systems are hugely diverse and actually quite threatened, and we're beginning to realize that in Southern Europe now. So my question to you is whether in Palestine, are they silvopastoral or silvoarable? So do you have livestock underneath the olives, or do you have crops? And if crops, well, what crops or what livestock?
Sometimes there's grazing under the olives, especially for sheep and some goats, but mostly grazing is in a few areas. It's not that much. In the past, it's more, but now it's fewer. They do grazing, especially because plowing. There's do a lot of plowing in olive orchards. For other crops, they used to have intercropping before more. Now is less. Sometimes they use faba beans, some legumes, and other things like that. For it's also good for fertilizing the soil. So these practices is also they are disappearing slowly here in Palestine, unfortunately. So we need to encourage farmers to go back to these good practices and to do more about legume, for example, as intercropping for olives and other things. But this is the main things. But in the past, they used to have many crops under olives, and they do more grazing under olives. But also, we have to understand there's many olives are in the mountains and the slopes and other things like terraces areas, and this is have a lot of ecological infrastructures like slopes and walls and stone walls and other things which are most important for biodiversity. and increase biodiversity. And this area for do more agricultural practices like intercropping and other things. And all that will improve the biodiversity and important of this area for conservation. Also, it's very important to understand that 54% of the whole agricultural area in West Bank is for olive, and 95% of these areas are rain-fed. So there's no irrigation systems and the less use of herbicides, pesticides, and this is what makes these areas very important for biodiversity conservation. There's no conventional agricultural practices. It's less, more traditional practices. And unfortunately, lately, they use more herbicides, but this is few areas, so they can contain in this time. If we leave this, there will be more use of herbicides, and that will destroy these areas like Europe. And now in Europe, they use the term of high nature value farmlands, which try to protect what they remain in Europe. But here in Palestine, we have really huge area with this category, let's say.
Thank you. And a final question: you mentioned grazing livestock and so forth. Do they incorporate any other trees as fodder trees or to support livestock through dry season? So you often see pear trees or elms grown alongside the olives as an additional source of fodder. Does that happen in Palestine?
Yes, there are a lot of trees in olive groves, but mostly for human consumptions, for animal consumptions. Like we have fig trees, almonds, carob, and other many wide trees like Pistachia, Palestina, and other species for like Mediterranean, Mediterranean trees, other Mediterranean trees in this olive fields. But mostly they use almond, fig, and other small trees.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, fruit trees, great. Thanks. So yeah, there will be very diverse systems then. That's lovely.
Thank
you. That's very interesting. Can I make a comment? I was always very struck. Firstly, sorry, Marcus said that the rainfall in Sinai was 100. So actually, it's probably about less than 100 millimeters a year. The best data we have, which is not very good, it's about 80 millimeters on average, which is of course very low. I don't know what it is in Palestine. Probably a lot higher than that.
Yeah, we have around 400 to 600 and sometimes 700 millimeters, depending on the area.
Yes. No, I mean, there are areas in the Wadi Araba that are even 50 or less millimeters. So then it goes up to 800 millimeters in the Golan and the Galilean and the higher mountains.
I was very, very struck by a paper and the work of one of our colleagues at Nottingham on deserts and very arid areas where the biodiversity really depends on an intact soil crust of lichens and bacteria. So the question of ploughing is actually a really important one, and more important as you get more and more arid. I remember being very struck by a paper analyzing the classic satellite image of the difference across the border between Israel and Egypt, where the claim was that overgrazing had destroyed everything on the Egyptian side, but not on the Israeli side. And this paper claimed that actually it's about the soil crust and destroying the soil crust.
Yeah, that's a good point, and we need to research this more. But our own experience in our own garden here is that even the olive tree production increased by reducing plowing, by not having plowing. Merely at the end of the spring season, when the undergrowth is dry and brown, you can cut it basically to avoid the potential for fires, but that's cutting it, as you said, without disturbing the soil itself.
Yes.
Because of the richness of soil. Soil biodiversity, in my humble opinion, is the most important aspects for prevention of soil erosion and desertification and things like that.
Yeah,
Anyway,
interesting. The
yeah.
only soil in Sinai is in the gardens. There's virtually no soil outside the gardens. Our colleague Peter Crittenden studied a very interesting system in Namibia where most of the biodiversity was driven by the lichen crust, which itself was totally dependent on nitrogenous input blowing there in the wind from a massive seal colony. It was really interesting.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions from the group here or outside? Somebody, Nuruddin, go ahead.
Firstly, thank you very much, Marcus and Francis. Thank you very much, Dr. Mazen. Thank you, everyone. I'm Nuruddin. I'm working in Environmental Quality Authority. In my opinion, let me make a comment, please. In my opinion, if we are working more and more about awareness, it will improve. It will help the improving and keep the biodiversity in Palestine. For example, now in Palestine, we have a problem with invasive alien species. For example, from insect or from plant. Like from plant, ambrosia is one of the main problem for the north in Palestine about the olive tree or other land. Or also we have a problem with the cochineal now in the cactus. I think you know about that problem. If we work about awareness with many organizations, with many environmental office, we can improve the situation for biodiversity. As you know, that there is a many challenge for biodiversity. First of it, the occupation in Palestine, the Israeli occupation is one of the main problem also. But we should work more and more about awareness. That's my comment. Thank you very much for all.
Yes, thank you. I couldn't agree more. The major problem in the area that we work in is political will. I spent 2.5 years running a project in the Ministry of the Environment in Cairo. And coming from a university, it was a real shock because you had to persuade the Minister of the Environment, who wasn't a scientist, about the value of conservation, which obviously is a complete given for people who work in universities. So it was exactly that, public awareness. We put a lot of effort into public awareness, particularly in school books for children. And if you're interested in looking at those, they're all on my website. That was a very interesting process, producing material with environmental issues encapsulated in little stories and taking them out to hundreds of schools across Egypt. That was again something that an academic like me had no idea about.
Would you please put the link to your website in the chat?
Yes, I will.
It's that little thing on the right, like a speech button. Yeah, I think we could benefit a lot from such education material. And, we have been doing some education, both, the EQA, Ministry of Agriculture, NGOs, academics, institutions like ours have been doing a lot of education. But you're right, one of the biggest challenges we face is policies and procedures. And here in Palestine, part of the reason why we went from before 1948, the only reason we went before 1948, 75% of Palestinians were subsistence farmers. Now it's less than 5%, maybe it's 3.5% or so. This is catastrophic in my humble opinion, and it destroyed our economy, but it also destroyed our environment. And the Israeli occupation, a lot of our research now is focused on the impact that was mentioned of the Israeli occupation on our environment, the Israeli colonization activities, the industrial settlements, the industrialized farming that was developed in the Jordan Valley and elsewhere. That's devastating our environment. And we need a lot more research in those areas. And we need, but research is nice, but you have to also bridge the science, policy, practice gaps. Those two gaps between science and policy and between policy and practice must be bridged. And we have a new National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan now from the Environment Quality Authority that we worked on collectively with a lot of other people. But again, you can make nice strategies, you can make nice plans, whatever. If you can't implement them, if you can't convince enough decision makers and power brokers, so to speak, to take it, change things. This is a huge challenge for us. Not doing the research. Ahmed Al-Omari, for example, did some nice research on biodiversity of olive groves, but again, if it does not followed by policy and procedures, it's not going to be applied. Okay, any other questions or comments?
Well, I'll just follow on that, and reflecting both what Francis and Nuruddin have said, actually, awareness raising is seldom necessary for the people on the ground. Most of what I've done elsewhere in the world and what Francis has been saying about Sinai is that we are learning from the farmers and the practitioners there. So we don't need to persuade them of what sustainability is or what works or what maintains biodiversity.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing we need to learn in conservation to do, and I say this as someone from a big global North university, is to somewhat step away. And we need a better channel of communication from practitioners through to policy without it having to be externally validated or without needing to persuade people in politics that these things are important. So I don't have a solution, but it's reflecting a problem that we're seeing all over the place, is that we've got this separation of cultures, and really the answers are often already there.
Okay. My other question for you guys is, what can we collaborate on? How can we get you to Palestine? Francis, you're retiring, so you should have more time on your hand to travel.
Well, we have a house in Sinai, and so we will be going there regularly.
Okay.
And it's not so far from Palestine.
Yeah. We'd love to have you guys come here and for us to think of what projects we might do collaboratively. Whether hoverflies, I would love for us to collect a bunch of hoverflies and send them to you for identification, and maybe write a paper on the hoverflies of Palestine.
That would be very interesting. There is work being done now in surrounding countries, in Jordan, for example, and certainly there's a lot of work in Turkey. So that would be very interesting. With 400 millimeters, you must have quite a lot of surface.
Yeah. Have anybody looked at the molecular biology of hoverflies? Did molecular phylogeny?
Oh yes, it's hugely exploding field at the moment. There's a massive project in the UK called the Darwin Tree of Life, which is attempting to sequence the UK fauna
Mhm.
And there are dozens and dozens of hoverflies as part of that.
We are collaborating with the Natural History Museum on molecular phylogeny in London, and we've done some work. For example, one of our master students just defended her thesis yesterday on molecular phylogeny of orchids from Palestine. And tomorrow, if any of you are interested, the audience, Tamara Al-Ali is defending her thesis on beetle molecular phylogeny, Coleoptera, from Palestine, two families, Dermestidae and Maliridae. So that's at 3 o'clock tomorrow. I can send you the links if Francis or Marcus are interested. The other people already got the link.
Please, that would be interesting.
Okay. Right.
On collaborations, I'm very happy to talk about biodiversity analysis, particularly macroecological patterns or diversity maintenance in landscapes. It's very unlikely I'm going to be able to travel to Palestine, at least for the next few years, for personal reasons. I'm not traveling much at the moment.
Okay.
But if you want someone to come in for advice on the analysis, then please let me know.
That'd be great. Thanks. Okay, it's almost noon, so here. So if there's no further questions, anybody has a last question to send us? We will resume this. We had a hiatus for a while because of school programs and so forth, and end of semester. But we will resume these events Thursdays at 11 o'clock. We started them for the NBSAP structure, National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. But we collectively decided, and I'm sorry, Dr. Isa and Muhammad Mahasna are not here, but we collectively with everybody decided to continue them. As such, as you see, useful events, an hour every week brings our capacities together and potentially increase our collaborations. So thank you very much, Marcus and Francis.
Thank you very much. I'd love to hear more about the olive work. If anybody can send me links, that would be great.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'll send you, Ahmed, their email, and you can send to them. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to meet you all.
Take care. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.